What started out as just another day in the ordinary life of a medieval town has suddenly become some kind of horrific nightmare. It's raining dead bodies. As people in the streets are trying to dodge the flying corpses, the shock of this gruesome sight sends everyone into a panic. The smell is stomach-turning, but the real threat is the one you can't see. An invisible killer has just been unleashed.
The Black Death.
This is biological warfare in the medieval age, and today on History Unveiled we take a deeper look into this brutal method of war. The nature of viruses, diseases, and infection during the medieval period was not very well understood. Common folk knew of them as people would get sick, of course, and certain methods were sometimes used to combat this threat. But how effective these methods were varied wildly. Bad smells and dirty water were identified as sources of illness in what was called the miasmic theory, the belief that bad air would carry disease on it which you could breathe in. The churches and religious orders, which often preached cleanliness, became associated with healing and care, and used methods like employing censers, containers for burning incense during religious ceremonies, to keep the foul odors away and make the air clean. The origins of disease were often blamed on curses, a punishment from God, or even witchcraft. With little to no understanding of viruses and infectious diseases, and a seemingly invisible force killing friends and loved ones, rich and poor, with all manner of suffering for those unfortunate enough to catch them, it's easy to see how people believed it was caused by the supernatural. Whether it be by sins and suffering you brought upon yourself, or by some kind of spiritual wickedness brought by enemies or villains, all the common folk knew was fear. And these attitudes helped keep the church in power as the population believed they needed their assistance to help with these problems. While that was certainly one way of inadvertently using the sick to keep you on top, there was another way to gain an advantage: on the battlefield. As they say, all is fair in love and war, and especially in times of war, cunning and perhaps uncaring commanders would use anything and everything at their disposal. As mentioned, dirty water was widely understood as a way to get sick, and so getting a clean water source was of course a cornerstone in building any village, town, or city. With this in mind, it makes sense that if you were to wish harm and suffering upon a population, you could try and contaminate their water supply. This was a practice utilized all around the world from invading forces against their enemies. Illnesses associated with this strategy were cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, or waterborne parasitic infections, all of which often caused severe diarrhea, high fevers, abdominal pain, and dehydration, which could often be fatal if left unchecked. If an army marches on its stomach, then how well will they do when they're in this sort of state? An example of this chosen tactic was at the siege of Chateau Gallard in Normandy in the year 1203 during the conflict between King Philip II of France and King John of England. The French soldiers were said to have diverted a nearby water supply and introduced animal carcasses to the wells. In another siege in Calais in 1346 to 1347 during the 100 Years' War, the English cut off the French water supply for the city. This forced the inhabitants to drink from contaminated and brackish water sources, no doubt causing misery for everyone living there. Indeed, in each of these cases, the use of biological warfare contributed towards or directly caused the defenders to capitulate and surrender. Apparently, collateral damage and the suffering of innocents was a winning strategy. A slightly more direct approach to spreading illness is to simply fling carcasses through the air and over the defenders' walls. With the marvelous machines known as catapults, armies were able to gather animals who died of sickness or whose bodies were rotting and no longer fit for consumption and use them as ammunition. While this might sound somewhat absurd, it posed a very real and genuine threat to defenders trying to hold back an attacking enemy force. The physical damage caused to people and structures would have been minimal, but it was an effective method of biological warfare. One example of this was in northern France during the siege of Thagny-Vec in 1340. According to contemporary accounts, the English soldiers launched dead animals into the town using trebuchets, which caused a devastating outbreak of disease that killed many of the inhabitants. The defenders reported that the stink and the air were so abominable they could no longer endure, and subsequently negotiated a truce. The French would later go on to use this same strategy during the War of the Burgundian Succession. The French army allegedly used infected animals during the siege of Tournai in 1479. According to contemporary accounts, they launched diseased animals, including horses and cows, over the city walls using trebuchets, which caused a severe outbreak of disease among the defenders and civilians. Perhaps the most famous incidents of biological warfare in the medieval period were the intentional spread of the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. According to historical records, the first time the bubonic plague reached the European continent was on the back of the huge territorial gains and military successes of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century. Having carried the plague across the Eurasian steppe, the Mongol armies had reached the city of Kaffa on the northern coast of the Black Sea in 1346. Having besieged the city, the Mongol army, under the command of Yanibeg Khan, began loading the dead bodies of recent plague victims into their catapults to weaponize the plague itself. It was thought that the bad smell that the plague victims gave off would spread across the city and make the Genoese defenders of Kaffa sick. Needless to say, this worked, if not for the exact reason that the Mongols had thought. Unfortunately for humanity at large, working too well and likely causing the greatest number of collateral damage casualties in the history of human conflict. Fleeing civilians and the Genoese sailors would board ships and sail to various ports around Europe, spreading the bubonic plague into mainland Italy and directly towards Central Europe. The plague spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the European continent and into North Africa. It became known as the Black Death and would go on to kill an estimated 75 to 200 million people worldwide. But hey, the battle for Kaffa was won, right? Well, no actually. The Mongol army was eventually pushed back, and so the result was everyone lost. Now, you might think that after the first time weaponizing the bubonic plague had spread death across most of the known world, military commanders might be cautious about doing something so rash again. But this is the medieval period where caution was often thrown to the wind. Over the course of the next 4 decades, Europeans had begun to gain some understanding of the Black Death, but not entirely. Victims were being isolated and quarantined in some places, and most people tried to avoid the bodies, but it appeared that the clothing of the Black Plague victims could also carry the disease, likely believed again because of the smell and filth associated. In actuality, the bubonic plague is spread by fleas, parasites often carried on rats and other animals who were all too common in the dirty streets of medieval society. Fleas, however, will jump to many things to keep warm, and this includes clothing. During the Castilian Civil War in Portugal at the Siege of Lisbon, from 1384 to 1385, the Castilian army gathered clothing said to be infected with the bubonic plague and loaded them into their catapults. Launching the infected clothing into the city streets, the fleas hitching a ride would naturally jump onto any creature that passed them by, and before long the Black Death was ravaging the entire city of Lisbon. It turns out history would repeat itself in 1395. Almost 50 years after the infected corpses were catapulted over the walls at Kaffa, the city would once again find itself besieged, this time by the Tartar army of the Golden Horde, led by Edigu Khan. In an eerily similar incident, the Tartars would load their catapults with infected clothing and launch the bubonic plague into the coastal city once again. Naturally, this sparked a fresh outbreak of the virus, which would go on to infect and kill many more of the inhabitants. This time, however, the invading forces would eventually be victorious, increasing the Mongol control over the Crimean Peninsula and marking a power shift in the Black Sea. If at first you don't succeed, well, that might be a little extreme. Biological warfare is nothing new. Throughout our history, people have found ever-inventive ways to weaponize the world around them, even manipulating forces we don't understand. In the heroic age of knights and duels and honorable nobles, the truth is little to no care was given to protect the innocent from suffering and death. Indeed, human life was apparently not worth much at all, at least if it wasn't your own, that is. Ah, what a time. If you want to find more videos like this, then check out the rest of the channel and hit the subscribe button to see what comes next and discover more of History Unveiled.